So, welcome to my podcast. I'm so thrilled you're here. And so, maybe start by introducing yourself. And yeah, you're another one of the people I LinkedIn met, and then we had a really interesting conversation. So, I'm super glad we're doing this.
Yes, no. Thank you, Ida, for the invite. Happy to talk. My name is Mardoqueo Arteaga. Colloquially, I go by Mark. I feel like I try to encourage people to try Mardoqueo, or in Spanish, I guess you would say Mardoqueo. And I'm currently an economist at KPMG. I finished my PhD from Fordham, what is that now, 6 months ago? Although it does feel like it's been a lifetime. So it's kind of crazy. But I'm very happy to chat today.
Yeah, so yeah, that was my first question. Does it feel like it was a long time ago that you finished the PhD? Because the PhD, it's a weird part of your life, right? Because it takes a long time and it's a very specific environment. And I always think of it as like a prolonging the transition to quote unquote real adulting. Because like yes, it is stressful. Yes, you have to work a lot, but also you do have more freedom and flexibility in many ways than in a real job. So how was the PhD for you, and how does it feel to be in the real world now?
The real world, yeah. I mean, I know it can be somewhat scary at times to think about, you kind of lose the structure of a university setting. But I would say that, I don't know, PhD doesn't really have that much structure to begin with. A lot of it is really up to you. And so the transition from PhD to, I guess, the beginnings of a career aren't too dissimilar in that a lot of it really rests on what it is that you want and how seriously or how often you want to do things for it. I mean, when it comes to dissertation, for instance, it's you versus you, right? And that's pretty much how I've been feeling these last couple months with just in your career and figuring out my path. I do definitely miss the kind of like the lax environment that grad school can give you, especially in PhD. You wake up, you say you spend 3 hours looking through literature and maybe you don't get much done that day, but you pat yourself on the back for reading. Can't really get away with that anymore. So it's definitely been a transition of the priorities and the scheduling. I know they always say to treat your PhD like a job or have certain hours that you work on, let's say, a dissertation. That doesn't always happen for a lot of people. I know for me, like there are days I told myself I was going to work from like, let's say 9 to 5 on my dissertation. And you end up not doing that because you have the flexibility. And I think that the transition here is just now there's actually other dependence on your work. And perhaps that's not what happened during grad school. So I think that's the only real difference, I would say. But a lot of the juggling of the different things that you have to do for the job or just competing priorities in your own life, I think more of that stays the same. And if anything, I would argue that PhD is a great time to kind of develop those skills because there are no people who you are accountable for besides yourself.
Yeah. And I think that's a little bit the fallacy of life in a way, that you always feel like there will be a point at which it will be very different, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
when I graduate, then life will be easy. Or once I get my first job or after I get promoted, right? And it's kind of always the same thing because it is you versus you. And so how did you end up doing a PhD?
Oh, yeah, it's a long-winded way to kind of end up at PhD world. So a little bit about my background. I'm originally from El Salvador, and I came to the United States when I was about 6 years old. And so I kind of grew up bouncing around in the US. My family and I were undocumented because we left El Salvador because of gang violence and all the nasty stuff that you used to hear a lot about in Central and Latin America. I know now recently El Salvador has changed, but I want to give that context because I didn't really come from a family that knew anything about anything in terms of academics or graduate school or anything like that. And so I kind of entered academics seriously around the time I was like around 12, like early teenage years. And that was mostly because I finally caught up with the reality of my life, which was I'm undocumented. I don't really have any sort of background to fall back on. Like there's nothing really there for me. I have to figure it out on my own. And I saw academics as a way to kind of supersede all of that or kind of like overcome all of the personal barriers that I found myself in. And it was through doing relatively well in academics and finally being able to go to undergraduate and finding good mentors and professors, that they said, hey, listen, like you can probably do a PhD if you would like to. You have you have the intellectual capacity, you have the interests, you're always very curious, you had great questions. Like, is this something that you'd be interested in? And to be honest, when they first mentioned that, I didn't really know the distinction between that. I didn't really know what the PhD was going to entail. Like, I don't think most people do know until you actually start focusing on it, or maybe talking to people who've gone through it. And to me, it just sounded like, oh, doctor, like that's not, I don't really know what that is. And I didn't really know what the applicability of it would be either. I didn't think I wanted to be a professor. At least that's what I saw from the people that had PhDs and who were kind of guiding me in undergrad. So it wasn't until I had an internship my junior year of undergrad. I worked for TIAA, and the CEO at the time there was Roger Ferguson, who's the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve. And I had a conversation with him that really spurred me to think about a PhD as a means to have a very fulfilling life, not necessarily as a sufficient condition for a fulfilling life, but definitely a necessary condition. And he has been such a great mentor to kind of talk to about that, because with his background of being a minority and just kind of like him telling me about the way that he navigated his early life really opened my eyes to what a PhD could do for me. And I don't know, I had opportunities to go work after undergrad. It didn't really seem as interesting to me. And I thought, well, like this is a great way to kind of break another barrier that people from, with my background don't normally get to break. So let me try it. And so I applied. And by I guess all the work that I had done up to that point, I convinced a number of people that I would be worthy to do so. And that's how I ended up doing it. I originally thought I was going to research things relating to immigration and relating to my personal background. Not only was I undocumented, I also had DACA, which was that Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy that came out in 2012. And around the time I was finishing undergrad, it had been maybe 5-6 years since it had come out in 2018. So there was some data, not a lot of data, very newish policy. Politically, the United States was in a very interesting place, to say the least. So there was a lot of back and forth on whether policies were effective to integrate immigrants and whether it was worthwhile to even think about that. Mind you, the DACA population at most, I think, was like 800,000. So it wasn't even that big of a population on the whole. But then I got to the program and I started actually figuring out interests that were beyond my own personal, background. And it turns out that that was just not really a space that academically or intellectually I was that interested in pursuing. So I ended up dropping that. But in any case, I came to the PhD thinking, okay, I know I don't want to necessarily do academia. I have a number of people who I've made contacts with who have done things outside of academia, and they've been rather inspiring. And here's a potential research agenda by which I can, do a PhD and perhaps find something to do outside of academia for or with. And that's how it started.
Yeah. So I want to dig into the PhD as a means to have a fulfilling life a little bit.
Yeah.
Now that you said it, I think I thought about it in a similar way. And can you somehow articulate that? Like, what was it about the PhD that would help have a fulfilling career?
Yeah. So the way that I took all the pieces of advice that I received about that with the whole idea of a fulfilling life is that I was coming from a perspective where I felt like there were a lot of caps on things that I wanted to do, or boundaries, or let's say ceilings of things that I wanted to do. And that had been just a personal problem for me for most of my life up until that point. And so when I started seeing, where people with PhDs were able to end up with, looking at data from, let's say, the survey of earned doctorates, or just looking through LinkedIn and kind of like looking at different career paths, this seemed like a really interesting tool or an interesting credential to obtain that kind of removed a lot of the boundaries where you can go. I know that, for instance, Esther Duflo has this paper, right, as economist as plumber, right? This whole idea of there are so many different problems that an economist can tackle and solve. And you feel like a plumber in a sense where, it doesn't really matter where the leak is. You can kind of go ahead and figure it out. And so taking that perspective to me felt like, okay, well, this is obviously something I would want, because it's something, it's a lens by which I can view the world, and a lens where the world can view me, where I don't necessarily have to feel so uncomfortable that I can't surmount something that's in front of me. So I saw it as that, as like a tool, almost like a Swiss Army knife in a sense too, because it blended a lot of what I consider an important aspect of economics, which is the philosophical aspect, which may or may not have been lost, I think, in some of the graduate programming that we all get. But it blended that, which is where I think I felt the strongest, at least initially with my background. But it also added this very rigorous technical programming, data science, like it added that component to it as well. And it's like, oh, well, here are the main issues that are facing our world today, which is, big data, but also the ethics around it, and the questions that surround it, since economics is the study of us, and how we allocate things as well. So to me, it really felt as if this was the discipline. If I was going to get something that was going to propel my life in a totally different direction than what I ever thought, this was this discipline to do it in. And there was really nothing that I probably couldn't do if I was able to get through a program like that. Right. So for me, it wasn't just fulfilling. It wasn't a fulfilling life in the sense that, oh, you get the PhD and for some reason you feel fulfilled because you have a PhD. It's that now that you have this as a necessary condition, you can now go into the world and perhaps be fulfilled from the other things you can do with it.
Right. I'm smiling because I feel like this would be a great advertisement for econ PhD programs around the US, and elsewhere too. Yeah. But it resonates with me a lot. So when I was in undergrad, I liked math and I also liked engineering. And so I was kind of on the fence between doing math and economics and engineering. And in the end, I did math and econ because of this blend of rigor, but also tackling questions that are about us. Yeah. And you can see that in the tech industry, economists are hired in many places, I think, because we are good at asking the right questions. And then, of course, we have the tools like causal inference and so on.
Absolutely. I like you. So I did economics for undergrad as well as mathematics. But I really wish I would have stuck with something a little bit more about the more ethical or more philosophical in nature, to be asking these questions. I can't speak for engineering, but I definitely respect that, and I wish I had more of the sciencey brain for that too. But I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Your comment about potentially the lack of these more philosophical parts of the curriculum,
sure,
and parts of the PhD education. At least I didn't spend, I would say, as much time as I would have wanted in retrospect, really reading, I don't know, some of the classics and thinking about it in a non-mathematical way.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Fortunately, it's something you can always come back to.
Yeah, definitely. We can attribute it probably to Samuelson in terms of the mathematization of economics and all the how it's gotten now.
Yeah. I also feel it, at least for me, the older I get, the more interested I become in these types of things. And when I was 19, I wasn't as interested. Probably I was more interested in just the math. I was skip the philosophy.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I think that, I don't know. I think that there is merits to both, and obviously in the marriage between them. I try to be as holistic as possible when thinking. Well, at least I tried to be when I was thinking about going for the PhD and doing all the readings that I did, and trying to make sure that I was coming at it for the right reasons, if that makes sense. I didn't quite know what I still don't know what the career trajectory of mine is going to be, or where exactly I want to take this. But at least I feel comfortable enough knowing of the foundation that I have, and all the ramifications or considerations that I make when making choices.
Yeah. So speaking about that, what was your dissertation about, and how did that lead you to the job you have? Was it related, not related? And also, if you could talk a little bit about the famous econ job market, which I think is very specific to economics.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like other disciplines could definitely use a centralized job market the way we have it. But yeah, I can definitely speak a little bit about that. So my dissertation was essays on empirical macroeconomics and expectations, and I very much so cared a lot about that last piece. I think if if my personal background didn't influence my study of, let's say, immigration policy or things that it definitely influenced my interest in expectations. And that really came from a lot of the macro courses we were taking in the first year. You really start trying to mathematize this idea of rationality and kind of like ways that people maximize, just the regular models that we have in macro one, macro two, right? So in thinking about the mathematical models that we had, I started thinking, okay, well, I wonder where the literature has gone since, let's say, 2008, when it was very evident that a lot of the macro approaches that we had were not really taking into consideration certain things that we probably should have been considered. So there is a really interesting survey paper from Vines and Mills. I forget their first names, but it was the Rebuilding Macro Project. And in it, they were basically just interviewing a bunch of macroeconomists as to where is it that macroeconomics can change for the future, given the fact that now we have so much data on people's actual behavior that obviously aggregate into macro. So it was a very micro-founded approach to trying to tackle a lot of these macro questions that we were having.
Right.
One of yeah,
I was just at the NABE
yeah,
Tech conference, and I had basically this conversation with someone where the conclusion was that macro is getting better because it's becoming more micro.
yeah. Well, who would have thought that making something that is thinking about people in the aggregate would benefit from thinking about understanding people in the individual sense, right? Like, I don't know. So for me, I also took that piece rather seriously, because part of my viewpoint or perspective was, how can we make economics a more maybe accessible or more equitable type of discipline? And this seemed like a potential avenue to do so. One of the recommendations from that survey was thinking about how can we think about different types of expectations, where, bounded rationality had been a thing for a little while. The learning literature had been a thing for a little while. And one of my professors, whose doctoral advisor was Michael Woodford, talked to me about this whole idea of, let's say, learning or bounded rationality, and kind of really started getting me interested that it wasn't just a thought, it was an actual field of study that people were actually thinking about. And that was kind of like the initial impetus towards a literature that explored expectations, which honestly was very vague at first because there wasn't good data on expectations. And expectations, I'm talking about, what are people perceiving in the future for, let's say, inflation or unemployment? And so the way I thought that maybe I could somewhat contribute to this kind of literature would be to take newer data sets that were coming out for these kind of like macro indicators and seeing how well are they panning up to, let's say, some of these policies that central banks are putting out there. So some of the literature in this space that is more popular nowadays is, how effective is central bank communication in, putting out their target rates, and do people actually listen to that? And there's a difference between, Wall Street and Main Street that they try to say, a difference in the way that central bank communicates. And so I got really interested into that space. My eventual job market paper, my first chapter of my dissertation, was on that, on central bank communication efficacy on the general public. And that was basically using data that was being solicited from households, not like Wall Street or, amazing investors or anything like that, just regular households. And basically looking to see, when are central bank communications being effective in transmitting their target rates to the public? Are people actually then in turn accepting that and then changing their behavior in such a way that the policy actually becomes real in the economy? Because that's like the big piece in when you look at DSG models, for instance, right? Is that you have the monetary piece, you have the output piece, supply piece, things like this. But there's that assumption that the policy that the central bank is going to put out there is going to be as effective because people are taking in and believing that whatever the policy is going to be in the future actually becomes reality. So I wanted to figure out that friction between reality versus, or the perceived reality versus what the policy was trying to do. And that was my first chapter, and kind of like my intro to thinking about expectations and where they fit in our scope of the economy today. My other two chapters were in the same vein, I looked at credit market expectations, and I tried to create my own set of sentiment, if you will, from the newspaper articles, using like advanced techniques like natural language processing, and just trying to come up with my own series of expectations and trying to predict downturns in the economy, simply because I personally had this feeling, and this is actually coming from a gentleman named Cars Holmes, and I'm probably butchering that name, but he's out in Europe. I think he's Dutch, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of his work dealt with this kind of feedback loop or feedback cycle, he used to call it, or he calls it, with this idea of expectations drive policy, which drives expectations, which eventually is going to get, all muddled and confused. And so you have to have good data to really pinpoint where people are deviating from what we would consider, let's say, rationality in the models that we use in macro.
So this sounds extremely fascinating. And as someone who does macroeconomic modeling as part of my job, I'm wondering, did you have a chance to look at any heterogeneity in those frictions? Meaning, how are different segments or subsegments of the population more or less receptive to what the central bank says? And maybe some people don't know at all what the central bank says, right? And some people really follow it.
Yeah. No, that's part of the burden, obviously, of data is going to be how rich of a data set do you have in order to find this kind of heterogeneity. But yes, usually you find people who are much more, quote unquote, financially literate, and that really depends how you want to define financial literacy, right? But it's true. I mean, I think in order to read or to understand most central bank communications, the recent study was 13, 14 years of school. So a little bit more than college educated, at least partially college educated. And even then you may not fully comprehend the whole thing. So yes, so there are findings where I did segment between financial literacy as well as demographics and as well as occupation. Less obviously, but more white collar type of occupations that are more college, more geared towards people who are college educated, had a much more, how do you say this, targeted response or adequate response towards some of these policies. They had much more anchored expectations for, let's say, inflation, as opposed to people who had completely egregious expectations of let's say 10, 15% of inflation. And that was the median of what they thought was going to happen.
Oh, wow.
I mean, obviously in the last couple of years, maybe people can see inflation has gone way up. But I was really looking at prior to the whole inflationary period that we had in the last, year and a half, 2 years. It was really in that kind of sweet spot period, if you will, post Great Recession, prior to COVID, looking at that decade of when interest rates were kind of low, inflation was kind of low. There really shouldn't be that many surprises, and yet we still see a lot of heterogeneity amongst not just demographics, but also, again, literacy rates and just in occupation. So you see that even during times when things aren't crazy, there's a lot of disparity. So obviously, when we have a situation like, let's say, the last year and a half, 2 years, that'll only get augmented in terms of how the outcomes come out. So yeah, it was a really interesting study. I cannot say that that's something that I currently do with my job. That really, it wasn't. I think it was more of the skills that I showed in my papers that were kind of interesting for people looking at, let's say, causality, or kind of how do I ask a good question around policy and whether or not it was effective or not. I don't work necessarily in a macro shop at the moment, but that's fine. The idea was to kind of let loose or let out all my intellectual curiosities. And I think that with my dissertation, I kind of did that. Maybe I'll revisit it one day. I'm not sure.
Right. And the other thing I'm curious about, obviously most people don't read the central bank statements from their website, but the information they consume is mediated by the news outlets they consume. And so I imagine there would be interesting heterogeneity across those lines, even within, say, college-educated white people or blue-collar people. Were you able to control for any of that?
Yeah, there's a section of my paper that kind of looks at it, and not just from, you're talking about news. I didn't look at different, let's say, companies of news, but you can do something really quick, which is what I ended up doing, which is just looking at things like Google Trends and Twitter Trends. Google Trends in specifically when there is a certain, let's say, for instance, they talk about large-scale asset purchases, or the quantitative easing that came out in terms of terminology. when you kind of cross-reference when certain policies come out versus interest, let's say through Google Trends, you find some really interesting kind of weird patterns of certain types of people or certain, let's say, areas in the United States where you see a lot of traffic of those trends occurring. Other parts of the United States, not really. Like the interest is kind of the same throughout the time period. So yes, in terms of media consumption or media channels, I think there's a really interesting paper that I saw floating around the Twitterverse recently that kind of talked about the idea of attention and how we view attention and how kind of like in social media, particularly let's say Twitter or Reddit, news stories that get picked up and that are circulated around often end up being the thing people end up talking about. And so that may not necessarily be good for central banks, because if they want to say a certain story, or they want to say, let's say we won't be increasing rates, right? Like, or we don't want to do X. If the thing that gets circulated around in social media is a news story that has a certain angle towards what that means, then that's the thing that people are going to really be taking, not necessarily what the central bank wanted to say, but what the perception of what they're saying means. And it's almost as if that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because that's what people are going to react to.
Right. This is really, really interesting. So I'll make sure to link to your paper and all the other papers you mentioned in the footnotes to the episode. So
Sure.
let us segue to how you got your current job. How was the experience of the job market? I know it's typically daunting, I think, the first time you look for a job. So I'm curious how that was from your experience, and also what you do in your current role.
Sure. Well, they're both heavy topics, I think, in terms of the job market. So I will say, I think that the centralized job market that we have on the AAA website is a great place to go to if you just want to see what kind of jobs are out there. So even if you're not on the market, I think it's a great exercise to kind of go on there, see what's out there every year, just to kind of understand what jobs could potentially be out there.
Yeah, and
However,
sorry, let me just interrupt for, I guess, the
yeah,
non-econ PhD people, what the AEA is. So the econ PhD job market is very centralized, which is actually a very nice thing. And I've talked to PhDs from other disciplines who don't have that. And basically, the jobs are posted in one place. There's one conference where people interview. It's all kind of centralized. It starts in, I think, January, right? Mostly.
yeah.
And so there, you don't have to ask yourself, where do I go to look for a job, in the same, in that sense.
Yeah, which is really nice. And recently, in the last couple of years, it's all been Zoom interviews. So you don't even need to, be too crazy about going or anything. Now we live in a digitized world. So both pros and cons, I would say. So I was looking through that job posting listings for quite some time, even from my first year onwards. I didn't do anything outside of my PhD for the first year, as people in PhD for econ probably know. You take your qualifiers at the end of that first year. And so for me, that was kind of like the main goal, to kind of survive first year. Afterwards, though, it was my intention to somewhat complement what I was learning in the classroom, particularly when it came to like anything dealing with econometrics, and apply that somewhere. And so I started looking for kind of jobs, or I don't want to say roles, not full-time roles, but just anything that would hire me as a contractor or as a consultant or as an internship for my second year onwards. And that's what I ended up doing. I didn't find anything necessarily like that on the website. It was just kind of me reaching out to people on LinkedIn. And so I am a huge proponent for economists to put themselves out on LinkedIn, because a lot of the jobs are not necessarily going to be posted anywhere, not just AEA website. A lot of them are usually just word of mouth or internal applicants or things of that nature. So I basically had an internship every year from my second year onwards. And at odd and random times, I ended up working for a marketing science company in my second year, and they were trying to expand their kind of like growth marketing space using data analytics. So did a lot of basic causal inference exercises for them, trying to guide their growth marketing dollars in certain campaigns or not in certain campaigns. And what I think that does is it really forces you as the economist to think about how do you convey, how do you translate the work that you're doing to people that absolutely have no idea or have no background in it. And I think personally, that is an incredible teachable moment that anybody in a PhD should be having from very early on, because then that made the transition years later into industry much easier than I think that it would have been otherwise. After that, I was working for a logistics company called Reef. They also had Reef Technologies. They used to be called Park Jockey. A lot of what they were trying to do was they were trying to convert a lot of their real estate space into the ghost kitchen phenomenon. Ghost kitchens became very popular during COVID because everybody was ordering food, or everybody was, trying to, get food delivered to their houses and stuff. And there's a lot of real estate that these people own, and they were trying to come up with pricing strategies. So my job was kind of looking from different regions and coming up with price elasticities and recommending different types of price points to segment different consumer bases off their ghost kitchens. After that, I worked for the Central Bank of Chile, and that was a visiting research position I held for almost a year. And that actually came in part from a job posting I saw on the AEA website, but it wasn't a direct posting that they put there. It was a person whose name was on a job posting from Princeton University. And I reached out to them because during that year, it was my third year, I wanted to make a website for myself that wasn't a Google site for my research and my CV and things like that. And I didn't really know anything about HTML or CSS, but it was still pandemic time. So there's a lot of time that, you're not really doing much. So I reached out to this professor at Princeton who was the point of contact for this position. And I said, hey, I'm really interested in your website. And his website was made on GitHub. So I asked him if I could just take his code, and if it wasn't so, I don't know, I didn't know what the right etiquette was. I just asked. He said it was fine, and it was through him. He and I kind of discussed. He said that he had a couple of advisees that he did who were at the Central Bank of Chile. I told him some of my interests in the expectation space, and I connected with one of his former students who was working full time. And it was through him that I learned about this visiting research position. So I held that for about a year, and then eventually, right before my last year, my fifth year, I also found this internship at KPMG, where where I have my current job, but it was in a completely different service line. So that was for something called transfer pricing, which, if people don't know transfer pricing, think of like economics marrying regulation, if you will. The science of of transfer pricing, I think, used to be a bigger thing maybe back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when there was a lot of market design work to be done in that space. Effectively, you're trying to find what a multinational company should price their inter-firm price between goods and services across different countries, because everybody wants a piece of tax revenue, obviously. And I worked in that mostly through this contact that I had created, who was speaking on transfer pricing at my university at Fordham. I just reached out to him. I told him a little bit about my background, my data science background. He said, oh, this could be something interesting. I ended up not really liking it. But I did end up finding my current team, which is the Economic and Statistical Consulting team. And I was speaking with the national leader of that team, who said, well, we were thinking of posting something on the AA website, but you're already here. Like let's just have a chat right now, because if you can save us the search. And I said, well, this might be mutually beneficial, because you will save me the search. Here I have 4 years of looking at this website, not really being part of the job market, or not being at the right time for the job market. And I was I was preparing to go into it, and I was doing all like the right prep work. And here was an opportunity to interview for a position before they even posted that out there, simply because I was part of the ecosystem already. So that's how I ended up landing the job that I have now, is that I kind of snagged it before they even put it on the AEA. And I was it was fortuitous in the sense that I was at the right place at the right time, and the opportunity just happened to show up. So,
Right.
Yeah.
But listening to your story with all the background you gave, it does not seem completely coincidental that you happen to be in the right place at the right time, right? Because you had done all of this networking before, and
Right.
a recurrent theme seems to be, I reached out, I talked to this person, and so on. So
Yeah.
do you have any kind of strategies that you think would be applicable I think really to anyone who wants to succeed professionally that you would recommend.
Really, it would be what you just mentioned. I mean, this whole idea of reaching out, I know it can feel daunting. And for me, I think it was in the beginning. But given my personal background, I feel like one of the things I kept going back to was there really is not much to lose if I just reached out and I appeared to be somewhat persistent in trying to talk to people whom I thought had interesting positions or did interesting work, or in the case of the Princeton professor, had an interesting website. I find myself that being really curious and coming from it from a very curiosity driven standpoint usually gets people to be receptive to what it is that you have to say or what you have to ask, because you're not really coming at them expecting anything outside of a good conversation. And I think that networking in many ways is not really it shouldn't be networking just for networking's sake. It should be networking with intent and with some idea of creating relationships between people. The further on you go, I feel like the more quickly you realize how small the world ends up being, and people that work in a certain space all kind of seem to know each other somehow. And I found that to be the case as I kept talking to people and reaching out and just listening to how people were using, let's say, their PhD or using their professional experience or doing data, like good practices for data science. And so I've had a number of conversations with people that I otherwise would have not thought of speaking to or been too shy to do so. And I think that I got over that hurdle of, oh, they won't want to talk to me, by thinking, well, I either don't ask them to talk to me or I don't come up with an interesting reason why I want to talk to them and I never speak to them, or I try to, and two things can happen. They don't answer me, which is fine. Like I'm back on square one, or they could speak to me. So really networking and kind of just being curious to me was kind of like the best chance you have at learning more about what's out there that you don't know, and also just building your network and building the things that you do know. And now I'm very grateful to say that people have been rather receptive to when I try to talk to them and just learn about what they do. And I think that particularly for minorities, I think this is or people who are not from the United States generally, I feel like this is a barrier that often gets brought out, which is, I don't think that people are going to want to talk to me, or maybe I'm being disrespectful by reaching out, or maybe one of those, iterations of those excuses. And I feel like that's not really the case. I don't feel like that's the case at all. I mean, the worst that can happen is that you don't end up talking to that person,
Yeah,
So
which is guaranteed to happen if you don't reach out.
exactly. So from a risk averse perspective, or from like a risk perspective, you can lose you can either lose by not doing anything, or you can give yourself the chance of winning by doing something. And I don't know, for me, it was just a very straight shot way of kind of doing it. So I definitely recommend for people to just reach out, be interesting, be interested, and be purposeful with who it is that you're networking with. Really do your homework. I feel like that's been something that has really helped me, understand, like even let's say the conversation you and I had a couple of weeks ago is, this person obviously has a persona online, like she has a whole reputation for this is what they're about. So, but let me learn about that instead of coming into something blind. And I think that that's been something that really differentiates creating a relationship versus just creating a network and saying like, oh yeah, I have a contact here.
Right. Yeah, and it has to be genuine, right? Because you can't really fake interest. At least I don't think so. I don't know. I mean, maybe probably some people can, right? But in the long run, right? I feel like truth kind of comes out, and I read a quote somewhere that always listen as if the other person could teach you something, and right, and I think if you have that attitude, it makes it much more interesting to speak to other people.
I definitely agree. I don't think that thinking that you know everything. Thinking that you know everything is kind of scary. I mean, I feel like that got beaten out of me during PhD. You go to some of these classes and you think, what's going to happen tonight? And you can go into these things and you realize how little it is that you know, because there's just it's the collective, I guess, knowledge of everyone that comes before you being tried to be passed on to you. It's like, how can you sit there and not find any of that interesting? So even in conversations, to your point, thinking that you can always learn something. It's absolutely true. The least you can figure out is that I learned that that person has nothing new to contribute to what I'm doing. That's
Right,
something you
right.
didn't know before.
It is. And I think even if you reach out to people, and my experience has also been that most people are receptive and they reply and want to talk to you. Of course, it has happened to me that I write to people and they don't reply, right? But I mean, I just don't dwell on it, right? It's a numbers game to some extent too.
Agreed.
But actually, most people are really nice. And about the interest thing, do you think that's something that everyone can cultivate? Like, suppose someone listens to this and says, like, but there's nothing I'm really that interested in. Like, where do you start?
That's a good point. I mean, I would say that interest is not something you're born with. I don't think I don't think I had interests that just naturally came to me. A lot of it was through reading and through kind of opening my mind to the variety, because I had nothing necessarily that spoke out to me, let's say, at least academic as a teenager, outside of, like, let's say, math, right? Like, but even if you do have one thing that you're passionate about, it, read. And particularly, I would say read about people who are in that space that you're thinking about. Let's say, for instance, your interest is in music and you say, oh, well, there's nothing as generic as music. It's like, fair. Pick a musician you like, see if there's a biography about that person, see what they did. How is it that they ended up being a musician in that industry? Usually you'll find something. I mean, when I was a kid and I was thinking about why I should be interested in academics, or why I should try really hard, and given, being undocumented, et cetera, like, I ended up being really fascinated by Theodore Roosevelt. And I picked up on a biography of his, kind of like going through his life of, sure, it was privilege, but a lot of it was marked by, like, adolescent frailty, like almost died a couple times, had a lot of people in his family pass away. But the thing that really drove me to his story was the fact that he was super, like, vivacious. Like, he was just energetic about life and he was happy to be alive. And he was interested in birds and animals. And then he was interested in naval warfare and just like this variety of a smattering of things. But the thing in common that I saw about him and a bunch of other historical figures I've read about, a lot of them are very well read themselves, and they find interests from their breadth of what they consume. And so I try to do that in my own life, try to cultivate interests that are not necessarily economics, or even when it was economics, like going through the PhD program. If I was reading, let's say, Moscalel, like for intro to micro, that, like, that first year hazing that you go through. Also picked up, something about the philosophical writings of Adam Smith, just to think about a completely different way of thinking about microeconomics, or the way that economics was before it was completely mathematized. And you start reading about their lives, and you start reading about what influenced them to eventually come up with the theories that they proposed. I think that's where people can really draw inspiration from, is trying to humanize a subject, or humanize a concept from the people who created it, and why is it that they created it the way they did? Like, what are the things that were going on in their lives that influenced that? For instance, Moscalel was somebody who was very much so influenced by what was going on in Spain, but during his adolescence, like the whole dictatorship situation going on in Spain, like his whole getting through undergrad, graduate programs, et cetera, it was really driven through him being kind of like a social activist in a way. And that's really interesting to think about, because it gives you a different perspective, and it potentially gives you different avenues to think about his eventual research and his eventual contribution to the field. So definitely read and keep your mind open.
Yeah, I think that's a great recommendation. I'm a huge fan of reading history myself, and especially biographies. My dad's actually a historian.
Oh,
So, yeah. So I feel like this is a maybe nice ending point to segue into our Spanish part of the episode, unless there's something you left unsaid that you would like to add before we do that.
uh, not necessarily. My team is currently hiring, so if anybody is listening to this and they are trying to get into the job market, and they are candidates, please reach out to me. It's posted on the AA website now, so it'd be curious to see kind of people that we end up with. But I'm excited to go into the Spanish portion. I don't know if your listeners know that you are actually quite fluent in Spanish.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll find out. Who knows? And yeah, I guess for context, my husband's Mexican, so that's hence the Spanish. So yeah, we'll link the job posting and your contact and so on in the show notes.